So today I want to talk about Instacart, the gig economy, and labor. So during 2020 and the pandemic, Instacart more or less became an essential business in a lot of people's eyes. The model of having workers purchase items from stores and then delivering them directly to customers' homes placed Instacart in a unique position to capitalize and make a ton of profit during the pandemic. What was previously a model purely of convenience, often based around class lines, quickly became a model of safety, where people who are immunocompromised, the elderly, and those who just generally fear the virus prioritized ordering their products online instead of going to the store, which changed the dynamic and made it so that there were less points of contact, less people in the stores, and made for a generally safer situation during the pandemic in general. So even though class still likely played a factor in who was a customer and who was a worker, and thus who was at more risk, there is a chance that the model did end up saving some lives, or at the very least, reducing transmission rates. And while Instacart did make a huge profit and capitalized off of this situation and continues to treat its workers poorly despite all of that, I think there is some value in acknowledging that the model itself actually did some good over the past months and year, during the whole pandemic. So with that said, I want to explore just how wealthy Instacart's become in the past year, how it has treated and continues to treat its workers despite those gains, and how Instacart has teamed with other gig economy companies to keep the law in their favor. So with that said, let's take a look at some of the stats about Instacart's wealth. So in 2019, when the year ended, Instacart was at approximately $7.9 billion in value. By June 11th, it was just under $14 billion. And they were in a place where the surge in demand from Instacart forced them to hire 300,000 new workers. And later, they were claiming they were going to hire up to another 250,000 more. The rapid growth set Instacart apart from a lot of its other companies in the gig economy, such as Uber and Lyft, who had declines because, going out decreased, like people weren't going out as much. So you had a situation where Instacart, again, was in this unique position to capitalize here. But by October, their company value had doubled what it started out with in 2019, or at the end of 2019, and was at $17.7 billion. And while that is remarkable, October is the latest that I was able to find, but I would certainly bet that that's probably gone up since, now that we're in 2021 and a few more months have passed. Instacart across the board has increased in value. There's a ton of investors in it. It's just generally doing very well as a company. So how is it passing, any of this on to its employees? Well, it's really not. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, Instacart doesn't really have that many employees, even though it has a ton of workers. And I'll explain. The way that Instacart's model runs from the customer end of things is you download the app and you go on the website, you order the stuff, and you get contacted by somebody, quite in the way that Uber or Lyft would, who's going to make your purchases for you. That person then delivers it to you, and it seems simple enough from the customer end. But from the worker end of things, you actually run into an issue where certain workers are employees and most workers are independent contractors. So the people who work on the ground in stores directly, so if you're hired directly by Instacart to work in a store and make purchases directly in that store, you are an employee. However, if you're anyone else, whether you're a driver or someone who does both, purchasing and driving, you are an independent contractor. And with that, comes a lot of problems. You don't get employee protections, you're paying double taxes, you're generally speaking, running your own business and licensing yourself out to Instacart. And so that gives very little in the way of protection or any sort of ability to hold Instacart accountable. And that, again, makes for a very bad situation that is really difficult to fight off. So when the pandemic really started hitting, near the beginning of, the end of March, beginning of April, Instacart workers had actually planned to go on strike. And NBC actually incorrectly, I think, calls them employees here because I don't think this is speaking specifically to the employees, but perhaps it is. And either way, the employees were calling on Instacart to provide its workers with personal protective equipment, such like masks, gloves, and hand sanitizers. Okay, so yeah, this is actually speaking directly to the employees. My apologies. $5 per order for hazard pay, and they're asking the company to change its current default tip from 5% to 10%. An estimated 15,000 shoppers nationwide were expected to refuse orders if the company did not meet their demand. So basically what you had going on here is the people working in the stores and literally risking their lives by being in the stores were put in a position where they were getting a very low tip of 5%. When you go to a restaurant, you imagine that most of the time 15 to 20% is standard. And these people are making money off tips and getting 5%. They wanted $5 for hazard pay from every order from Instacart. And I don't think these were unreasonable demands that they get protective equipment. So what was the response? Well, before I go into that, I want to go into how they've been treated before. So in 2019, when workers had gone on strike in quite a similar fashion, the response was really poor. So basically, a group of shoppers had gone on strike from November 3rd to 5th in an effort that organizers said was intended to cast light on their demands, which included a default tip amount of 10% per order. However, as of 2016, a default of 10% was already added to every order, but that had been reduced after a class action lawsuit was filed against Instacart, where a 10% service fee was added that customers assumed was going to employees. So they decided to reduce the people's tips in response to that. Furthermore, they cut a $3 bonus that was given to every worker that got a 5-star rating from customers. So generally speaking, they just ended up slicing people for trying to strike and trying to speak up for their rights. And the response, even to this day, as of March 30th, has been to ignore all of their demands. And they did change the default tip amount to 10%, but still allowed 5% to be chosen as an option. So people might pay 10% if they're not paying attention, but the 5% is still available. So you can just kind of select it and go back to what you had, which ultimately, according to a lot of people, is claimed that it won't make that much of a difference. And the bigger issue is that the two demands that went unaddressed were the hazard pay and the sick pay for workers who had to stay at home because they're at risk of contracting, this, or allowing other people to contract the respiratory illness of COVID-19. So basically, Instacart really treated their workers really poorly in all this. And so during 2020, another thing happened where a very, very small section of Instacart workers actually did try to form a union. And it was from a very small area in the Chicago area that had 15 people come together and unite in a very small collective with commercial workers, Local 1546. And this is in Skokie, Illinois. And so basically, on February 1st of 2020, they voted to join this union. And of course, the response from Instacart and all this was to write letters to the people voting on the union, trying to persuade them not to. So instead of it supporting their decision and everything, they tried to tell them how their union dues were going to be super expensive and how, the president of the union is actually going to control them with all this, and that you, as a member of the union, don't get a vote on your say and your pay, and that you'll actually be in a weaker position because if you disagree with what the union decides, then you don't have power. As we know, these are tactics that are used consistently by companies to try to persuade people from not joining a union and to sort of bust them without busting them. And so it really kind of comes off as scummy, especially with the way they're treating their employees and not giving them any care and retaliating against them for striking. With the union behind, it makes that a lot more difficult and it allows for a lot more publicity and information to get out. So I thought that was worth talking about. But that brings us up to the present day, where Instacart actually cut 2,000 or 1,900 rather of its jobs, the actual employees, in favor of shifting more towards its independent contractors. So in 2015, the company did hire a small subset of workers as employees who under US law are entitled to protections like minimum wage and can be subject to more direction and training by their bosses. What we found is that our shoppers require training and supervision, which is how you improve the quality of picking. Instacart Chief Executive Officer had said at that time, you can't do that when they're independent contractors. However, now, Instacart's moving in the other direction, eliminating 1,877 employee positions, of course, including all 10 of the workers who had voted to become members of the union. Now, I know that's a really small union, and it's a really small representation, but it tells you something that those 10 got specifically selected out of anyone else, out of all of the other employees they might have had. And I do understand a good chunk of the workers at the company are independent contractors, but of the employees, you happen to strike at all of the 10 who voted specifically in favor of the union. That strikes me as extremely sketchy and very anti-union. It's become apparent that companies like Amazon and a lot of the larger companies out there who are, major faces of delivering products to people's home in this day and age are very much against unions, and that companies are just going to keep fighting against it. And this is just another example as far as I'm concerned. So that brings us to the fact that in order to protect the position of their workers as independent contractors, and in sticking with this shift in perspective, it's actually been found that the San Francisco-based Instacart and other gig economies, including Uber and Lyft, bankrolled a successful $200 million campaign to pass a California ballot measure exempting them from a state law declaring workers were employees if they did work in the usual course of their boss's business. Emboldened by that victory, the companies are pushing for similar changes elsewhere that would make it easier to claim workers or contractors all across the country. So it had been previously decided that a judge in San Diego had come out and stated that the city's litigation against Instacart was in line with other recent related decisions, including the passage of AB 5, a labor protection law that was previously mentioned, which gives a greater labor protection to workers classified as employees. And basically, the judge ruled in their favor that all of the Instacart workers had to be treated as employees regardless across the board. That said, that's where the $200 million campaign comes from, and you get Proposition 22, which basically makes new rules around app-based drivers and contractors and labor policies. And the essential overview of it, just to keep it simple, is that it classifies drivers for app based transportation, such as ride shares and delivery companies, as independent contractors, not as employees, unless the company sets the driver's hours, requires acceptance of specific ride and delivery requests, or restricts workers for other companies. Independent contractors are not covered by various state employment laws, including minimum wage and overtime, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation, as I mentioned previously. Instead, independent contractor drivers would be entitled to other compensations, including minimum earnings, healthcare subsidies, and vehicle insurance. So they're throwing small little things in there to kind of incentivize it. But at the end of the day, this was a propaganda piece and a lobby effort by the industry, the gig economy work industry, to make sure that workers stay independent contractors and are not able to band together as employees, let alone form unions. And this strikes me as a really, really bad position for labor in all this, especially because during the pandemic, like I said, this company made record-breaking profits, and their model ended up doing a net good and service, but they should have still been providing care for their employees. And the fact that they couldn't even provide the basic necessities and requirements for protection, for wages and hazard pay and everything else, while their company keeps going up in value over the course of the year, while they're constantly hiring new employees, while there seems to be this wide range of growth. I mean, it's not surprising, but still, this company should be giving back to its workers, and it's not. And there's a constant drive to make sure that people can't band together, that they can't come together. And honestly, I think we need to really think about how we are treating the gig economy, because it's one of these lost areas where it's not quite, what we're used to as standard labor, and it's slipping under the sight of a lot of people and a lot of legislation that's allowing for people to really get hurt. And in some cases, this is all they have. And it's allowing people situations where they're working 12-hour shifts just to make ends meet. We should have moved past that. We should have been, promoting an 8-hour work day. These are things that have already been fought for. And of course, capital is always going to try to fight to push us backwards. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.